Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, an active and committed member of the House Judiciary Committee and ranking member on the Commercial Commerce Subcommittee.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 285, the SAVE Act. Human trafficking is never okay. It's a vile crime that no one should be subjected to, but the SAVE Act goes too far. This bill would impose a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years for posting or facilitating the posting of advertisements online. We should be eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, not creating new ones. This bill is not specific enough. It could potentially apply to communications providers and facilitators who are not actually engaged in sex trafficking. For example, an employee at an online advertising network that has no control over the types of ads they receive could face 10 to 15 years in prison for simply going in to work every day and helping advance the business. Web hosts and ad networks oftentimes do not have an advanced warning of the ads that are being sent to them. During our Judiciary Committee markup, I offered an amendment that would have removed mandatory minimums from the legislation, giving the judge hearing the case, of course, the discretion to impose a wise and just punishment. I believe in the overall goal of the legislation, but I do not agree with its execution. Judges working with the sentencing guidelines should determine sentences, not legislators. Mandatory minimums fail to reduce crime. They waste taxpayers' money and often violate common sense. I urge my colleagues to vote against this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady reserves. The gentlelady's time is expired. The gentleman reserves, and the gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
My privilege to yield 3 minutes to Mr. Bobby Scott, who has served so ably on this committee, and we congratulate him for his ranking position on the Education Committee. Mr. Bobby Scott.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I rise in opposition to H.R. 285, the SAVE Act. While I support the underlying goal of ensuring that those who facilitate sex trafficking through advertising are prosecuted to the full extent of the law, I'm opposed to the bill's mandatory minimum sentencing provisions. Mandatory minimum sentences have been studied extensively and have been found to distort rational sentencing systems, discriminate against minorities, waste money, and often require a judge to impose sentences that violate common sense. To add insult to injury, studies have shown that mandatory minimum sentences fail to reduce crime. Under this bill, the advertising of sex trafficking will result in a mandatory penalty of 10 or 15 years, depending on the circumstances of the crime. Now, there's no doubt that many of the individuals prosecuted under this bill should receive long prison sentences, but in some cases, a mandatory sentence of 10 or 15 years may not be justified. This is particularly troublesome when you consider the possible scope of defendants who could be prosecuted under the bill. Notably, the prohibition on advertising does not only apply to the sex trafficker who places the ad or the employee who accepted the ad, but also includes those who benefit financially from the ad. That's all the employees, including the receptionist or the computer guy, everybody on the payroll who might have seen the ads or read in the paper that the company publishes some illegal ads but decided to look the other way. They should be held responsible under the provisions of the bill, and many of them would certainly warrant a sentence of 15 years or even more, but not all of them. Madam Speaker, mandatory minimum sentences didn't get into the criminal code all at once, but one at a time, each one part of an otherwise good bill. If we expect to get rid of mandatory minimums, we have to first stop passing new ones like this. Madam Speaker, if people ask why a judge in Florida had to sentence Marissa Alexander to 20 years for firing a warning shot at her abusive husband, or why some drug dealer's girlfriend got 25 years when she had no meaningful role in his drug dealing, or why the United States has 5% of the world's population but 25% of the world's prisoners, they would not understand why anybody said they had to vote to further expand mandatory minimum sentences. 15 years in prison, mandatory, for everybody on the payroll that gets caught up in this bill. That's what's in this bill. No discretion afforded to the judge. The sentence would have to be imposed whether it makes any sense or not. Madam Speaker, if we expect to repeal mandatory minimum sentences, the first order of business is to stop passing new ones. This bill contains a new mandatory minimum that someday will require a judge to impose a sentence that violates common sense, and therefore I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm speaking for the first time. I ask unanimous consent to speak for such time
Without
as I might
objection.
consume. We started out this afternoon by saying that we join together in stopping the scourge of human trafficking and sex trafficking, and I still stand by that premise. I support the Stop Advertising Victims of Exploitation Act, and I do believe adding advertising and having the provision in the law that includes mens rea is an important protection, that there must be an intent to sell and to advertise to victims of exploitation. This, of course, is part of a number of proposals that we're considering today, and our only goal, we hope we're successful, is to combat sex trafficking. But as we have discussed with respect to these other bills, much more must be done to prevent sex trafficking as well as to aggressively investigate and prosecute these crimes. H.R. 285 amends the current federal sex trafficking statute so that advertising will now be one of the prohibited means of facilitating this type of exploitive criminal conduct. We know, of course, that technology, however, sometimes is tricky. The bill correctly recognizes the fact that sex traffickers increasingly obtain customers for their illegal acts through the means of mass communication, either through various forms of print media or via the internet. Maybe they throw in the cell phone or hardline as well. But they're out to get their victim. They're out to get that child. They're out to get that young woman or young man, boy or girl. And we must stop them in their tracks. In fact, sex traffickers use generalized marketplace web pages to advertise, as well as sites and pages devoted to advertising the availability of commercial sex. While the internet has enriched our lives greatly, these sex traffickers are only interested in using it in the most vile manner. And they use the internet to perpetrate heinous criminal schemes, such as selling of minors for sex. Without question, sex traffickers who advertise their schemes should be penalized for their criminal acts. While I recognize that some have raised questions about how the advertising prohibitions on this bill would apply to online companies, I am concerned that we have a free use of that. If I might throw in a word, net neutrality. Because of this, we adopted an amendment during the Judiciary Committee's markup last Congress. Then again, in a bipartisan effort to address such concerns, that amendment is included in the text of H.R. 285. We know, for example, however, that the way the internet is, some innocent person might wind up finding things on their internet or their site that they may not have had anything to do with. We hope the standard of mens rea will help those individuals have a defense. So as it relates to this legislation, I raise concern, as my colleagues have done, about the utilization of conduct of mandatory minimums, primarily because of the vastness of the internet and our friends who make the point that this advertising could wind up, or some act could wind up, without their knowledge. We know that one-size-fits-all approach, which is part of the mandatory minimum approach, to criminal actions in the form of mandatory minimums has greatly contributed to our nation's crisis of over-incarceration, and our Judiciary Committee, rightly so, has looked at this over the years. In the markup of this bill, the Judiciary Committee did not adopt an amendment that would have removed application of the statute's mandatory minimum penalties and instead allow a judge to apply an appropriate sentence under the circumstances of the case up to the statute's existing penalty, which I support enthusiastically, life in prison. Given the complicated nature of the Internet communications networks with respect to how advertisements are delivered, the role of the judge might help to carve through, to ferret out the facts and determine the level of guilt. So authorizing life imprisonment is a good thing. It would allow sufficient latitude for the imposition of extremely lengthy sentences where appropriate. I'm hoping as we move forward with this legislation that has a very important premise and point that we'll have the opportunity to discuss with our colleagues in the Senate to see how we can best make sure that this bill works to, in essence, target the bad guys and make sure that it does it fairly and directly, because sex trafficking, as I've always said and said on this floor, should be weeded out. Sex trafficking should not be. I ask my colleagues, again, to consider the mandatory minimum, and I ask my colleagues to support this legislation.
Does the gentlelady yield back the balance of her time?
Reserve.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I'd ask the gentleman, does he have any other speakers?
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the, and how much time remaining?
The gentlelady has 10 minutes remaining.
I'll yield myself in closing such time as I might consume.
Without objection.
We've had 3 bills so far, and we're getting ready to offer 2 others that all speak to this very devastating impact on our children, human trafficking and sex trafficking. I think the Stop Advertising Victims of Exploitation Act, H.R. 285, does focus on a particular niche that is heinous. Our children are on the Internet, they're tech savvy, and they are easily can become victims of an attractive sight or attractive sounds and music. So I think that this legislation, again, pinpoints a very serious issue. The bill is an amendment of an existing legislation that includes a mens rea. There must be intent. But we do know in the course of legislation we have the opportunity to make sure that what we do does meet the test of getting those who are truly the perpetrators. I would hope as this bill moves to the Senate, as we recognize the importance of this legislation, we again be reminded that one size does not often fit all, and that judges can rightly have discretion to a sentence of life. But I ask my colleagues to support this legislation so that we can have a comprehensive approach with the legislative bills that have been on the floor today to attack head on, if you will, those who prey on our children, young men and women, people who find themselves lost with no place to go and become the serious victims of child pornography, sex trafficking, human trafficking. And for every member, we know that in many times, the entire life of that individual is changed forever. I yield back my time with the asking of the support of the underlying bill.
The gentlelady gives back her time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, we've spent about an hour and a half today talking about how bad this problem is. The 2 previous bills were passed unanimously by voice vote. There seem to be 2 arguments against the current bill. One is that the net might be too broad. That has been responded emphatically by putting a knowingly standard in so that somebody who is innocent will not be caught up if an ad advertising sex trafficking appears without their knowledge. The second is the philosophical debate on mandatory minimum sentences. I think there are some crimes where there ought to be a mandatory minimum sentence. I know many of my colleagues sincerely disagree with that. But believe me, advertising kids, minor kids, for sex should be something that puts you in jail for some time. I'm glad this bill allows for life sentences in case of egregious offenses, But I think that even in ones that might be less than egregious, spending some time in jail will show this country and maybe others who may be tempted to get involved in this horrific business that if you are caught, you are going to spend some time. I urge you to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 285? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.